On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, a young woman knelt on a wooden scaffold inside the Tower of London and prepared to die. She was 35 years old. She had been Queen of England for less than 3 years, and in a few moments, a French swordsman hired specially for the occasion would take her head. What makes this story so extraordinary is not the execution itself. Kings had killed before. Power had always been a brutal game in Tudor England. What makes it extraordinary is the question of how she got there. Because to understand Anne Boleyn's death, you have to understand something that most people overlook. She was not brought down by her enemies. She was brought down by the people closest to her, the people who had everything to gain from her survival. Her allies abandoned her. Her family betrayed her. The man who had torn apart an entire church just to be with her signed her death warrant without blinking. This is the story of a woman who climbed higher than almost any commoner in English history, who changed the religion of an entire nation, who gave England its greatest ever monarch, and who was then discarded, framed, and executed by virtually everyone she had ever trusted. This is the story of why everyone betrayed Anne Boleyn. To understand what happened to Anne, you first have to understand where she came from. Because unlike the queens who came before her, Anne Boleyn was not born into royalty. She was not the daughter of a king or the product of a great European dynasty. She was, by the standards of the Tudor court, a nobody. Anne was born around 1501 in Norfolk, England, the second child of Sir Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard. Her father was a capable diplomat who had spent years in the service of the crown, but the Boleyns were minor nobility at best, wealthy enough, educated enough, but nowhere near the upper echelon of English aristocratic society. They were the kind of family that was always one good marriage away from true power, and Thomas Boleyn knew it. What Thomas lacked in status he made up for in ambition, and he was clever enough to recognise that in the Tudor world his greatest asset was not his land or his money, it was his children, specifically his daughters. So when Anne was around 12 years old, her father did something that would change the course of English history. He arranged for her to be sent abroad for her education, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, where she served as a maid of honour and learned French, music, and the refined arts of courtly life. Then a few years later to France itself, where she spent time in the glittering court of King Francis I, one of the most sophisticated and culturally vibrant courts in all of Europe. I want to pause here for a moment because this detail matters enormously. While most young English noblewomen of her era were being groomed for domestic life, Anne Boleyn was learning to move in rooms full of the most powerful people in the world. She was absorbing French fashion, French wit, French philosophy. She was learning to dance, to debate, to charm. She was developing a kind of self-possession and intellectual confidence that was frankly unusual for a woman of her time and her station. By the time she returned to England in 1522, Anne Boleyn was not just another pretty face at court. She was something different, something that the English court had rarely seen before. Contemporary descriptions of Anne are fascinating and contradictory. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the day. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an era when pale blondes were the ideal. She was slim and sharp-featured. Later enemies would accuse her of having a sixth finger on one hand and a large mole on her neck. Although historians today believe these were almost certainly inventions designed to paint her as a witch. What everyone agreed on, even her enemies, was that she was magnetic. She had a quality that made people watch her when she entered a room. She was witty and quick-tongued, with a sense of humour that could charm you one moment and cut you down the next. She wore French fashions and French styles at a time when that was considered exotic and daring. She read widely. She had strong opinions. She expressed them. At a court where women were largely expected to be decorative and quiet, Anne Boleyn was neither. She returned to England not as a great lady, but as something almost more valuable. She was interesting. And in the hothouse atmosphere of the Tudor court, where entertainment was everything and boredom was a constant enemy, Interesting was a currency worth more than gold. Before we go any further, we need to talk about Henry VIII, because you cannot understand Anne Boleyn without understanding the man whose attention she captured and whose obsession ultimately destroyed her. By 1522, Henry VIII was in his early 30s and had been King of England for over a decade. He was a remarkable figure, even by the standards of Renaissance monarchs. He was well over 6 feet tall, physically imposing, with an athletic build that he maintained through obsessive hunting and jousting. He was educated, fluent in multiple languages, interested in theology, music, and philosophy. He could write poetry, compose music, and debate scripture with the finest minds in Europe. He was charming and charismatic, and could make any person in his company feel like the most important person in the world. He was also, and this is crucial, deeply dangerous. Henry had grown up surrounded by the lesson of what happened to monarchs who showed weakness. His father, Henry VII, had seized the throne by force and spent his entire reign fighting to keep it. The lesson Henry VIII had absorbed from childhood was simple. Kings who bend do not survive. Power is absolute, or it is nothing. Combine this with a personality that was simultaneously generous and viciously vindictive, a man who could shower you with gifts and affection one day and have you executed the next, and you have some sense of the world Anne Boleyn was about to enter. At the time Anne returned to England, Henry was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and by all accounts, a dignified, intelligent, and deeply devoted woman. Henry had married her in 1509 when she was the widow of his older brother Arthur, and for the first years of their marriage, they had been relatively happy. But by the early 1520s, the marriage was in serious trouble. The problem was the same problem that would define Henry's entire reign. Catherine had not given him a son. She had been pregnant multiple times, but the children had died or been stillborn. The only surviving child was a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. For Henry, this was not just a personal disappointment. It was a dynastic catastrophe. England had only recently emerged from decades of civil war. Without a male heir, the succession was uncertain. The throne was vulnerable, and everything Henry's father had built could collapse the moment he died. By the early 1520s, Henry was already quietly exploring the idea of ending his marriage to Catherine. He had also, it must be said, begun taking mistresses. This was entirely normal for a king of his era. Nobody batted an eye. What mattered was that Catherine remained queen and that the court functioned properly. One of Henry's mistresses around this time was a young woman named Mary Boleyn. Mary was Anne's older sister. And then sometime around 1526, Henry VIII noticed Mary's younger sister. The exact moment Henry VIII became infatuated with Anne Boleyn is lost to history. What we know is that by 1526, he was writing her passionate letters, showering her with gifts, and making it absolutely clear that he wanted her. And Anne Boleyn said no. I cannot stress enough how extraordinary this was. When the King of England decided he wanted you as his mistress, you did not refuse him. You certainly did not continue to refuse him for months and then years. It simply was not done. Mary Boleyn had not refused. None of the women Henry had pursued before had refused. But Anne was different. She was clever enough to understand something that her sister had apparently not grasped. Being Henry's mistress meant nothing. It meant a few years of favour, a few gifts, and then you were quietly put aside the moment he grew bored and replaced by someone younger. Anne had watched what happened to Mary. She had no intention of going the same way. So Anne set a different price. She would not be Henry's mistress, she would be his wife, or nothing. Now, to fully appreciate the audacity of this position, consider what it required. Henry was already married. Not just married in a casual civil sense, but married to a woman who was the niece of the most powerful monarch in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Any attempt to end that marriage would require the approval of the Pope, who presided over the religious laws of Christendom. And the Pope, at this particular moment in history, was essentially under the thumb of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew. The Pope was not going to annul the marriage of the Emperor's aunt. Not willingly, not easily, not quickly. Anne knew all of this, and she held her position anyway. What followed was one of the most extraordinary political and religious upheavals in European history, driven at its core by one man's desire for one woman. Henry applied to Rome for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. The Pope stalled. Henry applied again. The Pope stalled again. The process dragged on for years while Anne waited, Henry fumed, and Catherine refused to quietly go away. During all of this time, Anne was not simply sitting at home. She was actively positioning herself. She cultivated allies at court. She promoted reformist religious ideas at a time when the Protestant Reformation was reshaping Europe. She recommended men for positions of power who would in turn support her cause. She was, by every measure, a political operator of remarkable sophistication. She also had real enemies from the beginning. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis loathed her and reported back to the emperor with barely concealed contempt, describing her as scheming and dangerous. The English people, who adored Catherine of Aragon, regarded Anne with deep suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. When Anne was occasionally seen in public, crowds would shout abuse. Some called her a whore, some called her a witch, the image of the dark-eyed temptress who had stolen the king from his devoted queen was being constructed in real time, and Anne could do nothing to stop it. But none of this stopped Henry. For over 6 years he pursued her, and for over 6 years she held her ground. Then in 1532 something shifted. Anne finally gave in and began a physical relationship with Henry. She became pregnant almost immediately, and that pregnancy changed everything. In January 1533, Henry VIII secretly married Anne Boleyn. She was already carrying his child. The problem was that he was still, technically, married to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope had still not granted the annulment, so Henry did something that would echo through the centuries. He simply decided that the Pope no longer had authority over him. Working through a new Archbishop of Canterbury named Thomas Cranmer, Henry had his marriage to Catherine declared null and void in May 1533. He was excommunicated by the Pope shortly afterwards. He didn't particularly care. The break with Rome was one of the most consequential events in English history. It created the Church of England with Henry as its supreme head. It set in motion the English Reformation. It fundamentally altered the religious and political landscape of the country for centuries. And it happened at its root because Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of extraordinary splendour at Westminster Abbey. She was visibly pregnant. She processed through the streets of London in a litter draped in white and gold. She wore her dark hair loose around her shoulders, in the tradition reserved for queens. She was at the absolute peak of her power. The crowds watching were largely silent. Where there should have been cheering, there were murmurs. Where there should have been celebration, there was something that looked disturbingly like contempt. 3 months later, on the 7th of September, 1533, Anne gave birth. Henry had been so certain the child would be a boy that the birth announcement had already been written in advance. At the last moment, someone had to hastily add a single letter to the word king. The child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Henry hid his disappointment. He insisted he loved his daughter and that a son would follow. Anne recovered and was soon pregnant again. But the first miscarriage came, and then another. And somewhere in the silence between those losses, the mood of the court began to shift. Here is something I want you to understand about the Tudor court. It was not just a collection of people who happened to live near the king. It was a finely calibrated machine of patronage and power, where every person's position depended entirely on the favour of those above them. If you supported the right faction, you rose. If you backed the wrong one, you fell. And when the wind changed direction, everyone at court could feel it, and everyone scrambled to catch the new breeze before the old one left them stranded. By 1535, the wind was beginning to change around Anne Boleyn. She had given Henry a daughter and then a series of heartbreaking losses. She was no longer the tantalizing prize she had once been. Henry had already begun to look at other women at court, and Anne's personality, which had once seemed thrillingly bold and exciting to Henry, was starting to wear on him. She argued with him. She challenged him. She had opinions on matters of state and was not shy about voicing them. She was fierce and passionate and jealous, and when she saw Henry flirting with other women, she made no secret of her anger. This was not what Henry wanted from a wife. What he had found so thrilling in a mistress had become exhausting in a queen. And then there was the question of enemies, because Anne Boleyn had accumulated a formidable collection of them over the years, and they were still there, still waiting, still watching for their moment. Let me now introduce you to the people who would ultimately destroy Anne Boleyn, because each of them had their own reasons, their own motives, and their own particular flavour of treachery. Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell is one of the most fascinating and sinister figures in English history. He had risen from extraordinarily humble origins, the son of a blacksmith from Putney, to become Henry's most powerful minister. He was brilliant, ruthless, hard-working, and utterly without sentiment when it came to political survival. He had originally been a supporter of Anne's, and the two had worked together on the project of the Reformation. For several years they had been allies, both pushing England in a more Protestant direction. But by 1535 and 1536, they had fallen out. The specific reason historians have debated for centuries, but the most convincing explanation is straightforward. Henry had made it clear to Cromwell that he wanted out of the marriage, and Cromwell, who had built his entire career on reading the king's desires and fulfilling them before they even had to be spoken, understood exactly what that meant. He needed to find a way to remove Anne, not just remove her from the marriage, but remove her permanently, in a way that could not be reversed or contested. Divorce would not be enough. If Anne was merely discarded, she remained a power in the land. She had supporters. She had Elizabeth, who was technically Henry's heir. She was unpredictable and sharp-tongued and perfectly capable of causing trouble from the sidelines. No, Anne Boleyn needed to be destroyed completely, and so Cromwell set to work. The Duke of Norfolk. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was Anne's own uncle. He was also one of the most powerful men in England, a proud and ruthless aristocrat who had always viewed the Boleyn family's rise with a particular kind of contempt. He had helped engineer their ascent when it suited him, but he had never truly considered them his equals. Norfolk represented the old Catholic aristocracy who had watched with horror as Anne and her reformist allies dismantled centuries of religious tradition. He despised the changes she had brought to England, and crucially, by 1536, he could see that Anne was losing the king's favour. Norfolk made his calculation with the cold efficiency of a man who had survived decades of Tudor court politics. He would not go down with Anne Boleyn. He would help take her down first. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Jane Boleyn was married to Anne's brother George, and it was her testimony, more than almost anyone else's, that would seal the fate of both Anne and George in 1536. Jane's motivations are murky and have been debated by historians ever since. Her marriage to George Boleyn appears to have been deeply unhappy. There is some suggestion that George was indifferent to her, possibly even cruel, possibly involved in relationships with other men. Whatever the reality, Jane gave testimony to Cromwell that she had witnessed intimate contact between Anne and George. It was testimony that sent her own husband to the scaffold. Thomas Boleyn. This is perhaps the most devastating betrayal of all, because Thomas Boleyn was Anne's father. When Anne was arrested and sent to the Tower, Thomas Boleyn did not defend her. He did not petition the king. He did not speak up at the trial. He sat in silence while both his daughter and his son George, who was also arrested on charges of incest and treason, were tried and condemned. Thomas Boleyn had spent his entire life climbing the ladder of Tudor court politics on the backs of his children. He had sent them abroad to be educated precisely so they could make advantageous connections. He had benefited enormously from Anne's rise, receiving titles and land and money. And when the moment came to protect her, he did nothing. He would survive Anne's death by less than 3 years, dying in 1539. History has not been kind to him. Henry Percy was a young nobleman who had been deeply in love with Anne before Henry VIII had taken an interest in her. The two had been close to betrothed before Cardinal Wolsey, acting on Henry's orders, had forcibly ended the relationship. Percy had been deeply wounded by this, and Anne had not forgotten. Now, in 1536, Percy sat on the jury that tried Anne Boleyn. He found her guilty. He reportedly collapsed after delivering the verdict, overwhelmed by what he had done. But he did it. The ladies in waiting. Among the most significant testimonies against Anne came from her own ladies in waiting, the women who attended her every day. The Countess of Worcester gave evidence claiming she had personal knowledge of Anne's improper behaviour with several men. Other women at court were questioned, and their words, whether accurate or embellished or entirely fabricated, were fed into Cromwell's case. These women had not necessarily set out to destroy Anne, but in the terror of Cromwell's investigation, faced with the implicit threat of what might happen to those who failed to cooperate, they gave him what he wanted. Now we come to 1536, the year everything collapsed. On the 7th of January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. Henry reportedly responded to the news by wearing yellow and dancing. Whether this is true or not, the symbolic reality was striking. The old queen was gone. Anne's greatest rival for legitimacy had been removed. But Anne's position was not strengthened by this. It was, paradoxically, weakened. Because with Catherine gone, the pressure that had kept Henry bound to Anne was reduced. He no longer needed Anne to justify his break with Rome. That break had happened. It was done. The Church of England existed. Catherine was dead, and Anne was still failing to produce a son. On the 24th of January 1536, Henry VIII was thrown from his horse during a jousting tournament. He lay unconscious for 2 hours. Some historians have argued that this accident caused brain damage that contributed to the increasingly erratic and violent behaviour of his later years. Whether or not that is true, what is certain is that the man who emerged from that fall was, if anything, even less willing to be crossed or challenged. And then on the 29th of January, the very same day that Catherine of Aragon was being buried, Anne miscarried again. This time, the child was clearly male. The timing was devastating. Henry, who was already in a dark mood, reportedly told her she would receive no more male children from him. By this point, Henry was openly courting Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale, gentle lady in waiting who represented everything Anne was not. Where Anne was sharp, Jane was soft. Where Anne was opinionated, Jane was deferential. Where Anne argued, Jane submitted. Henry was falling in love again, or at least falling into infatuation, and everyone at court could see it. Cromwell went to work. The case he constructed against Anne was built largely from rumour, gossip, coerced testimony, and outright fabrication. He identified 5 men who would be accused of having had sexual relationships with Anne. They were Henry Norris, a senior courtier and one of the most respected men at court; Francis Weston, a young gentleman of the Privy Chamber; William Brereton, another gentleman of the Chamber; Mark Smeaton, a court musician of lower social standing, who was the only one of the accused to confess. And that confession was almost certainly extracted under torture or the threat of it. And finally, the most shocking accusation of all, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, accused of incest. I want to be very direct about this because it matters. Almost every serious historian who has studied the evidence has concluded that these charges were fabricated. The accused men's alibis frequently placed them nowhere near Anne on the dates in question. The evidence was thin, contradictory, and often impossible to verify. The testimony against Anne came from a handful of women whose accounts were vague and second-hand. The entire process moved with a speed that was itself suspicious. From Anne's arrest to her execution took just 17 days. the outcome was never in doubt. Cromwell had selected the jury, he had gathered the testimony, he had constructed the charges, and above it all, the king had made clear what he wanted. On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As she was brought in through the Watergate, she reportedly asked whether she would be kept in a dungeon. She was told she would be kept in the royal apartments, the same room she had stayed in before her coronation. She reportedly laughed at this and then burst into tears. Anne spent the days following her arrest in a state of rising and falling terror. The accounts we have of her time in the Tower come largely from William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, who reported her words back to Cromwell, and his letters paint a picture of a woman who could not quite accept what was happening to her. She talked constantly. She swung between hysteria and dark humour. She asked about her brother. She asked about the men accused alongside her. She asked what evidence existed against her. She declared her innocence over and over. At one point, she reportedly said that she would be known as the cruelest queen that had ever been. This was not a boast, it was a lament. She understood that the story being told about her would outlast her. On the 12th of May, the 4 men, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton, were tried at Westminster. They were all convicted. 3 of them publicly maintained their innocence. Only Smeaton had confessed, and he reportedly repeated his confession at his execution, perhaps because reversing it would have done him no good by then. On the 15th of May, Anne and George Boleyn were tried in the Tower before a jury of 27 peers. The charges were adultery, incest, and high treason. Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the trial. The same man who had helped raise her to greatness now sat in judgment over her destruction. Anne defended herself with extraordinary composure and intelligence. By all accounts, her answers were clear, articulate, and convincing. She denied every charge. She presented arguments against the evidence. She challenged the testimony given against her. One observer noted that she had never been more impressive than she was in that courtroom. It made no difference whatsoever. The verdict had already been decided. The jury found her guilty of all charges. Norfolk delivered the sentence. She would be executed. The method would be at the king's pleasure, either beheading or burning. When she heard this, Anne reportedly said that she was sorry that innocent men would die because of her. It was a remarkable statement, not a declaration of her own guilt, but a recognition that the men condemned alongside her were dying for crimes that had never happened. Her marriage to Henry was annulled 2 days later, on the 17th of May, the grounds being that it had never been valid in the first place. This was a final cruelty that many observers noticed. If the marriage was invalid, then the charges of adultery made no legal sense. You could not commit adultery in a marriage that did not exist. But legal consistency was not the priority. Removing Anne Boleyn was. On the morning of the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was accompanied by 4 of her ladies in waiting, the same women whose testimony had helped condemn her. She was composed. Those who were present remarked on it repeatedly. She had spent the days before her execution alternating between fear and a kind of fierce calm, and on this morning the calm had won. She addressed the crowd in the way that condemned prisoners were expected to. She praised the king's mercy. She asked the assembled witnesses to pray for her soul. She said nothing that directly accused Henry or Cromwell or anyone else of wrongdoing. This was not weakness or capitulation. This was calculation. If she died raging against the king, her daughter Elizabeth, still not 3 years old, would spend the rest of her life tainted by the accusation that she was the child of a traitor. Anne chose her words for her daughter's future, not for her own reputation. She then tucked her hair under a small cap, knelt before the block, and the swordsman she had specifically requested, a specialist brought from France, took her head with a single stroke. She was 35 years old. Henry VIII was at Greenwich when he received word. By some accounts, he was relaxing in the garden. By evening, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Now we come to the heart of the matter. The question at the centre of Anne Boleyn's story is not simply what happened to her, But why? Why did virtually everyone who had benefited from her rise turn against her so completely? The answer has several layers. The first and most important is Henry himself. Henry VIII was the axis around which everything else revolved, and by early 1536, Henry had simply decided he wanted a different wife. He had been infatuated with Jane Seymour for months. His relationship with Anne had curdled from passion into frustration. She had not given him a son. She challenged him constantly. The thrill was gone. But Henry could not simply divorce Anne the way a modern person might end a relationship. She was queen. She had enormous political and religious significance. A simple divorce might leave her alive and powerful, a rallying point for those who opposed the Reformation or opposed Henry's authority. And there was another consideration that was perhaps even more personal. Henry could not afford to admit that he had been wrong about Anne, that he had broken with Rome, executed Thomas More, alienated half of Europe, and upended the English church for a woman who had then simply failed to deliver. Death was cleaner. It was final. It erased the inconvenience of the past. Cromwell understood all of this. His genius was to give Henry what he wanted while allowing the king to maintain a kind of plausible distance from the uglier mechanics of the operation. Henry did not need to explicitly order Cromwell to fabricate charges. He simply had to make his unhappiness known, and Cromwell would build the machine that delivered the result. This was, in fact, exactly how Cromwell had risen to power in the first place, by solving problems before they were asked to be solved. The court nobility, who turned against Anne, including her own uncle Norfolk, did so for reasons that were at once ideological and nakedly self-interested. Norfolk had never truly been comfortable with the direction Anne was pushing England. Her reformist religious views, her close connections with Protestant thinkers, her tendency to interfere in matters of high politics, all of this alarmed men like Norfolk, who valued tradition and stability over innovation. And beyond ideology, they simply had to survive. You do not remain a powerful figure in the Tudor court by defending people the king has decided to destroy. Jane Boleyn's testimony against her own husband is perhaps the most psychologically complex betrayal in the entire story. She was a woman trapped in what appears to have been a miserable marriage, operating inside a system that gave her almost no agency or protection. Whether she gave her testimony out of genuine grievance or political calculation, or simply fear of what would happen to her if she refused, we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that her words helped send George Boleyn to the scaffold. And then there is Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father. His silence is in some ways the most damning thing in this story. He was a man who had used his children as instruments of his ambition, and when the instrument was broken, he simply set it aside. He did not suffer for it in the short term. He died with his titles and his lands intact. But the deepest and most structural answer to the question of why everyone betrayed Anne is this. Anne Boleyn had made herself powerful in a system that did not believe women were supposed to be powerful. She had risen higher than almost any woman of her era. She had wielded real influence over the king, over religious policy, over court appointments, over the direction of the English state. And in doing so, she had frightened people, not just her enemies, but her allies, not just men, but women too. She represented a kind of female authority that the world around her had no framework for understanding and no tolerance for accepting. When the king turned against her, there was nobody willing to stand up for her, not because she had no loyal friends or people who wished her well, but because defending Anne Boleyn meant directly opposing Henry VIII. And in Tudor England, that was a death sentence in itself. The moral calculus was simple: save yourself or die beside her. Almost everyone chose to save themselves. Anne Boleyn was dead. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour 10 days after the execution. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to the son Henry had wanted for so long, the future Edward VI. Jane died of childbed fever shortly afterwards. Henry mourned her with what appeared to be genuine grief. Cromwell continued to be the most powerful man in England for another 4 years, until he made the mistake of arranging a marriage for Henry to Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose appearance Henry found deeply disappointing. He was arrested in 1540 and executed on Tower Hill. As he went to the scaffold, the crowd jeered at him. He died as he had lived alone. Norfolk survived for decades longer, navigating the shifting tides of the Tudor court with the same cold pragmatism that had always defined him. He came within hours of his own execution in 1547, saved only by the death of Henry VIII before the warrant could be signed. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the woman whose testimony had helped condemn her husband and her sister-in-law, survived Anne by 6 years. She eventually served as lady-in-waiting to Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard. When Catherine was arrested on charges of adultery, Jane was implicated in helping arrange secret meetings. She appears to have had a complete psychological breakdown during her imprisonment in the Tower. She was executed in February 1542, on the same day as Catherine Howard. Thomas Boleyn died of a fever in 1539, 3 years after his children. He was buried at Hever Castle in Kent, the family home where Anne had grown up, and Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, the child who had been the wrong sex, the child who had been declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, the child who grew up largely separated from the father who had discarded her, and barely knowing the mother who had died for her. Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England in 1558 at the age of 25. She would rule for 45 years. She would be the monarch under whom English literature, exploration, science and culture would reach heights that no previous generation had imagined. She would be remembered as one of the greatest rulers in British history. Elizabeth I never spoke publicly about her mother. She rarely acknowledged her. It was politically dangerous to do so. Anne Boleyn had been executed as a traitor and an adulteress, and even as queen, Elizabeth had to be careful. But there are small, careful signs that she knew. She wore a locket ring, a simple oval piece of jewellery that opened to reveal 2 portraits, one of herself and one of a woman historians have identified as almost certainly Anne Boleyn. She wore it quietly, every day, for years. It was perhaps the most private and the most powerful thing she could have done. The story of Anne Boleyn is sometimes told as a cautionary tale about ambition, or a romance gone wrong, or a clash between a willful woman and an unstable king, and all of those readings have some truth in them. But I think the most honest reading is simpler and more unsettling. Anne Boleyn was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and capability who rose to a position of real power in a world that ultimately could not accommodate her. She had made powerful enemies, yes. She had been difficult and demanding and sometimes politically reckless, yes. But the charges on which she was executed were almost certainly fabricated. The men who died alongside her were almost certainly innocent. The entire machinery of English justice was weaponized against her in the space of 3 weeks. And virtually no one, not her family, not her allies, not the men who had built careers on her patronage, raised a hand to stop it. She died on a spring morning in a courtyard inside the Tower of London. She was 35 years old. She had been queen for less than 3 years. And in the daughter she left behind, she had changed the history of England more profoundly than almost anyone who ever lived. The French swordsman who took her head was said to have wept afterwards. He was reportedly so moved by her composure that he could not bring himself to announce that it was done. And so Anne Boleyn's head lay on the scaffold in silence for a moment, and nobody spoke, and then someone said it was over. It wasn't, of course. It never really was. I hope you enjoyed this story. Anne Boleyn is one of those historical figures who rewards the closer you look. Please subscribe to the channel if you would like more stories like this, and I hope you're well wherever you are. Goodbye.